Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I can
Okay.
hear you.
I was hearing another voice and I didn't know
So was
what
I.
was happening there. Okay. All right. Let me. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, sir.
Fantastic. Okay. Yeah. So first of all, Tim, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Sure. Quite welcome. Anytime.
And since you brought up hiring, no, here at AWS we never hire anybody. We've only got like a little over 1.5 million Amazon employees. I think we need to stop, but no, we're always hiring. We're always hiring more people, more talent. Even on my own team, we're looking for more partner solutions architects focused on Microsoft workloads on AWS. Like Tim said, I feel like after you mentioned the legacy, I should have worn my I don't know if I can find it. I think I still have my original T-shirt from the first Nova SQL SQL Saturday event in was at the Microsoft building there in Reston.
Wow.
Long time ago. I don't forget when it was. I want to say early 90s maybe. I can't remember. But it was a while back. Yes, I'm dating myself here, so I should stop doing that.
You're fine.
But yeah, I was in Northern Virginia. That's where I met Tim. I lived there for many years. Then we moved down here to Florida in 2017. I've been working with SQL Server for a long time. Been with AWS for the past 6 years, and I still keep this on my deck. This bit about SQL Saturday, past summit, AWS summits. So much of this obviously changed because of the pandemic, but I still do it when I can. So yeah, so we're going to talk about SQL Server on AWS. At a high level, why, where, how, what's next, anything else, right? But let's get into what I mean here. So the first question there is why should you run SQL Server on AWS? And before I even get into that, just trivia. A lot of people don't realize more people run SQL Server, and there are more SQL Server workloads and Windows workloads on AWS than anywhere else. I get it. I get that the natural instinct is to think, oh, well, Azure, right? Microsoft Azure, Microsoft Windows, Microsoft SQL Server. Why not? But actually, more people are doing it on AWS than anywhere else, which begs this question: why? Why would you do that? I think there are a number of reasons. The number of services that we have, ranging from basic computing and storage to more complex things like our machine learning and data and analytics. Our uptime, we take a lot of pride in having the highest uptime of any public cloud provider. In terms of performance and cost, they're obviously not the same, and sometimes you have to get one, you have to sacrifice the other, right? Performance is going to cost money, and to save money is going to cost performance. But they do go hand in hand in that, like, just to give one example, right? With our Amazon EC2, which is our basic compute infrastructure as a service, if you will, we have over 400 different types of compute instances. You can optimize for CPU, optimize for memory, storage, network performance, and then different combinations thereof. And then in terms of innovation and experience, these do, I think, go very much hand in hand. AWS formed as its own entity in 2006. So at this point, almost 16 years ago. But it really started before that with work that was being done for the Amazon e-commerce platform. But even as a public cloud in 2006, I mean, years before any other public cloud was available, and it's not just a matter. That's not just bragging rights. Hey, we've been doing this longer. That's not the point. The point is how we use that experience. And customer obsession is one of our guiding principles. And I see it all the time. If I make a suggestion to an internal team, one of the service teams, hey, I think we should make such and such a change, they might shoot it down. They might like the idea, but guaranteed one of their questions is going to be, if not the first question, well, are we hearing this from customers? And that is what we use to guide this innovation of, what are customers asking for? In terms of business drivers, I mean, everybody has their own reasons for going to the cloud, for going to AWS. I talk about flexibility a lot, and as sort of a combination of the agility, the durability, scalability, the breadth of services. But like I said, everybody has their own reasons. In my experience, over the past 6 years as a partner SA, I find that, there's this one reason that really stands out more than the others. Everybody wants to save money. No matter what kind of money you use, everybody wants to save money. And when it comes to price performance ratio, this was a few years ago. This test was done by a third-party research firm and showed that price performance running SQL Server on AWS was much better than running it on Azure. Now, like I said, this was a few years ago. Well, a different firm did a similar study last year with newer instances, both on AWS and Azure, and came with a very similar result. Again, 2x price performance ratio, AWS compared to Azure. Beyond that, a big thing that from a infrastructure perspective that I always think is very important that people understand is the way that AWS is built. We have regions around the world, and that is very, very important to some people, and other people don't care at all, right? Just being honest, right? Some people, the fact that we have locations across the United States and in Europe and in Asia, South Africa, South America, that some people, that's very, very important to them. And other people say, no, I don't care about that. I just need to be up and running here in Northern Virginia, where we have a very large preference. I'm still used to saying here in Northern Virginia, right? Even though I'm not there anymore. But it's the way that this is all built. Every one of those regions has a minimum of 3 availability zones. Even if you don't see 3 publicly, trust me, there's at least 3 availability zones in every one of these regions. Often there's more than 3, and every one of those availability zones is, in fact, not a part of a data center, but every one of those AZs, as we call them, is at least one data center in and of itself. So how do you know when it's just going to be 2 different data centers versus 2 different AZs? Well, a big part of that is distance, and isolation is another part. So if 2 data centers are across the street from each other or even down the street from each other, that's still one availability zone. When you go to a separate floodplain and a separate power grid, now you're in another availability zone, which again could have multiple data centers itself. So the AZs themselves are separated miles apart, but we keep a very high bandwidth, low latency between them, so that, as you'll see on later slides, you can do things like automatic failover, synchronous commit workloads. I talked about innovation and experience. This gives you just a little idea of that. And this is not everything. This isn't close to everything. This is just from a Microsoft workload perspective. You can see, I apologize, it might be a little difficult to see, but we have here, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but back to Windows 2003 and SQL Server 2008 and all the way up to where we are now with SQL Server and Windows 2019 or now we're on Windows 2022 and SQL Server is going to be getting to that point. and all the other things in between, and the different ways that we address things, whether it be, again, it could be an IaaS solution or a PaaS solution, and different approaches to that right blend between self-managed and managed services. So that leads to the next question. Where can I run SQL Server on AWS, right? And then it comes down to this, do you want to rehost or replatform? And there are two different services. For running SQL Server, you're either going to run in Amazon EC2 or you're going to run in Amazon RDS. So EC2 is Elastic Compute Cloud, RDS, Relational Database Service. EC2 is that self-managed. You can get what we call license included SQL Server on EC2, which means part of what you pay for that instance, you're paying, hourly. You can shut it down anytime you want. If it's an on-demand instance, part of that price includes the cost of SQL Server. It could be Web Edition or Standard Edition or Enterprise Edition or even Express, in which case there is no extra cost. You can also bring your own license, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But you can get that license included option. But even if you do, that just means we're installing SQL Server and we're installing Windows. But the management at that point is up to you, the customer, or if you're working with a partner, as I do on a regular basis, then it could be managed by a partner. Now, RDS is different in that it's a managed service. And so we're going to handle a lot of that heavy lifting for you so you can focus on your business. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So with RDS, things like high availability, backups, patching, right? We're going to handle that for you, for the customer. Even if a partner's involved, AWS is going to handle a lot of those pieces. And again, allows you to focus on your business. You can set up, when you configure RDS for SQL Server, you can tell it if you want to be in one availability zone or two. And if you're in two, then we're going to handle that high availability for you and automatically fail over to the other node if necessary, or for doing patches, just like you would yourself. A couple of other differences I want to highlight between the two. So right off the bat, you see, okay, well, it's different. Why? What do we mean all for versions on EC2? But there's a limit on RDS. So with Amazon RDS, with SQL Server, it's only license included. That's the only option. You can't bring your own SQL Server license and run in RDS. So the versions that are available are the versions that Microsoft currently has in mainstream support, which is why you see 2012 on here now. If I was delivering this same presentation in August, 2012 would not be listed, because end of support for 2012 is this July. EC2 is a little bit, it's interesting because the same list applies for those license included instances of EC2. But because you can bring your own license, you could be running SQL Server 2000, for instance, on AWS if you had your own license to it. We can't provide a license to SQL Server 2000 that you would pay on demand anymore, like we could do with, say, 2017, 2019, etc. And there's just some of the other differences. I'm going to move on in effort to save some time, but just to highlight some of the differences. So from a licensing perspective, I know it's not everyone's favorite topic, certainly not mine, but I only have 2 slides, but they are very important. If a license was purchased prior to October of 2019, and that's very important distinction. It doesn't matter when it was migrated to AWS. It matters when the license was purchased. If a SQL Server license, like a perpetual license, was purchased prior to October of 2019, you can bring that license to AWS. You could still buy a license included instance, as I mentioned, but you could bring the license with a follow-up question being, do you have software assurance? Now, if you're running SQL Server 2000, and you've been paying for software assurance for 20 some years and just not using it, then I would love to meet you because apparently you have money to burn. But so odds are if you have software assurance, you have a newer version. But we do have quite a few customers running these older versions who do not have software assurance, and they can run them in a dedicated host, and they can run those for years. If you have software assurance, of course, you are entitled to the upgrades. You're also entitled to run it in shared tenancy on AWS using the license mobility feature of software assurance. If you purchased your license on or after October 1st of 2019, a lot of what I just said is still true, with the caveat being that you have to have software assurance no matter how you want to run it on AWS. There are still certain advantages to running it on a dedicated host, in being able to take advantage of the virtualization at the host level instead of the virtual machine level. But you do have to have software assurance if the license was purchased on or after October 1st of 2019. Or again, you do the license included. If you do bring your own license, either, no matter what the date is, if you bring your own license, you can take advantage of what we call this optimized CPU option. So even though I said before we had like 400 different varieties of compute instances, even then I get people coming to me and say, okay, but I want something a little different that you don't offer. Maybe I want even more RAM than what I can get normally with this, or I want this higher performance and this extra RAM, but I don't have the licenses on the SQL Server side for that many cores. Not a problem. That's where this comes in. When you launch the instance, what you do, like, let's look at this R5 12x large example here, right? It normally has 48 vCPUs, but when you launch it, you can say, disable the hyperthreading and only activate 8 cores. You'd still pay, from an infrastructure perspective, you'd still pay for that full R5 8x large, because that entire instance is still reserved to you. But from a SQL Server license perspective, when you look at that operating system, it's going to say you only have 8 vCPU. It's all it's going to report. It will report the full RAM of the whole R5 12x large, and you will benefit from the storage and networking performance of the full R5 12x large, even though you're only going to have access to 8 of the vCPUs. All right, so enough about licensing. Let's talk about high availability. I mentioned before the way we structure our availability zones within each region, and this is exactly why we do that, because I can have this synchronous commit, automatic failover set up, whether it's an availability group or I could do a failover cluster. And every time I recommend to people, do it in multiple availability zones within a single region. The latency is often less than 1 millisecond, and the bandwidth is very high, and it can support this, which means you have automatic failover, even though you're failing over to a second instance that's miles away from the first instance. One way I like to look at this from a disaster recovery perspective is I tell people what this means is, if there's a power failure, that's probably just going to be one building or part of one building. If it's an entire power grid, it could be multiple data centers. But of course, we have backup power systems as well. If a fire breaks out, or even like a tornado, right? You're talking about one availability zone or one data center within an availability zone. When you get to something larger like a hurricane, something we're all too familiar with here in Florida, that's when you're talking about more of a regional event. And so it depends on your level of comfort. Is Am I fine just within one region? Do we want to go to multiple regions? And we'll take a look at that in a little bit here. But two availability zones, you do have a certain layer of that disaster recovery, knowing that they are miles apart, even though you can do this automatic failover. If you're doing this with an availability group, it looks just like this. If you were doing it with something like Sios Data Keeper, you could replicate the storage and do a failover cluster, or you could use a service like we have a service FSX for Windows, which provides shared storage for Windows instances, and you could use that for your failover cluster. If you want to do this with RDS, it's not much different, right? Looks the same idea. It's still that multi-AZ failover capability. The difference is for RDS, it basically looks like this. You don't need to worry about any of the details. How does this work? It doesn't matter. That's the whole beauty of it, is we're going to manage that for you. I mentioned disaster recovery, and like I said, you could be in that one region, and there is a certain level of disaster recovery, knowing that these are miles apart. But here's where you can go to that second region, and in the second region, that's where you want to do that asynchronous commit, and therefore it would be a manual failover. But I don't recommend synchronous commit going between regions, even though we do work to keep the latency as low as possible. As someone said to me years ago, we can't beat the speed of light. Not yet, anyway. Right? So when you start going to a second region, the further away you get, the longer it's going to take just to get the data there. So I do recommend asynchronous in the second region, but synchronous within the region. Okay, so that's the nuts and bolts of running SQL Server on AWS. The next question is, how do I get there? How do I migrate my data? And you really have a lot of options. We have some of our own options and different tools to monitor that process and help you through that process, including we have what used to be Cloud Endure. Now it's the application migration service that can do a block level replication. And then we have the database migration service for the database level. But you don't have to use one of our services. If you can take the downtime, and we talk all the time about these 24/7 operations, and yeah, they're fun to talk about, and all of the requirements to make those work properly. But the reality is there are a lot of people that run SQL Server who maybe it's a store that when the store's shut down, not a e-commerce, but I'm talking, brick and mortar store. When the store is shut down, they don't need the database to be, accessible, or, for any number of reasons. They could afford, we can have, or a doctor office or whatever, but we can have that downtime where I could just do a backup. And I could upload that backup to S3, which is our object storage, and you can restore that backup either into an EC2 instance running SQL Server or into SQL Server running on RDS. You could extend an availability group from on-premises into EC2 if you wanted to do that. Or like I said, you could run, you could use the database migration service. And that is a tool that we developed to handle, not just for SQL Server, but to handle any database migration. And sort of a sister piece to that is the schema conversion tool that's not needed for a homogeneous like SQL Server to SQL Server migration. But if you want to move, let's say, SQL Server to Postgres or MySQL or something else, then that's where this would come in to help you make that conversion. And so that's the general idea there, is the ability to do a migration or a modernization. And either way, DMS, the database migration service, will allow you to replicate or maintain a replica and this continuous replication, as opposed to just, you can do it one time and be done, but you can also keep it going if you want to. All right, so how do I manage SQL Server on AWS? Right, that's the next piece, because I feel like it's a piece that all too often gets overlooked, right? We talk about where to run SQL Server and how to get it there, but that's not the end, right? Once you've made that migration move, to be truly successful, you got to manage it properly. So these are some of the services that, just some of the services that are, front of mind for what you're going to use to do that. CloudWatch is our ubiquitous monitoring service. CloudTrail is more of an auditing service. License Manager kind of speaks for itself, but yeah, for managing licenses. And then Systems Manager, I'll explain, actually has several pieces I'll cover here in a little bit briefly. We actually have, I've seen entire multi-hour presentations on Systems Manager alone. So I'm not going to go too deep on it, but I'll cover some of the highlights there. So this is sort of, you can think of this as an extension of CloudWatch. This is for Amazon RDS Performance Insights, where you can really drill in and see, okay, what SQL statement is causing the problem, what are the wait states, and really to diagnose and help you solve the problems. Same thing with application insights beyond SQL Server for .NET and SQL Server. This works for EC2, and you can see here several services involved to really diagnose what is the problem and how can I remediate that problem. And I'm going to send a copy of this whole deck to Tim, so you can provide it to everybody, Tim, and then you can reference this link. You don't have to
sounds good.
try to quickly type it right now.
Yeah.
So Systems Manager, like I said, there's a lot of pieces of Systems Manager. I'm only going to cover 3 right now that I think are really great. One is Run Command. I love this because, as it says, it's audited with CloudTrail. But the bottom line here is there might be certain commands, certain tasks that okay, I need people to be able to do this, but I don't want to just give them the keys to the kingdom and they could do anything, right? But they need admin ability to do this. So how can I give them admin ability to do this task, but not give them admin ability to do all these other things? And that's where Run Command comes in. You can package these commands in a way that you can allow someone to run this command, but without having to give them full access to everything. Even though you could, like, the command can run as an administrator, even though that person does not have administrator access. And again, you control who has access to those commands.
Hey, Tom,
similarly, yeah.
You have a question here from Krunal. Hey, Krunal, by the way. What are some good third-party monitoring tools to monitor SQL Server in RDS along with non-SQL? CloudWatch might not align with their needs.
Yeah, that's fine. So, more input from somebody. So audiences of all ages. So we have we do have the application insights, performance insights that are built in. The number one, I mean, there are multiple options, but the top one that comes to mind for myself is SolarWinds. So SentryOne was acquired by SolarWinds. I forgot when now. 2 years ago, maybe. But prior to that, I did a lot of work with SentryOne related to AWS and specifically related to RDS, not only EC2, but also RDS, because RDS is a little bit trickier in that you can't have an agent running on the server. And so SentryOne didn't require that, and so it was a great option. So I would definitely look into that. SQL Sentry, if you're familiar with that product, but now it's under the larger Solarwinds umbrella. There are other options, but that's definitely the first one that I would recommend. So I mentioned the run command. Session Manager is similar. It's a little more access than what you'd get with run command, but still, again, provides you a little more protection in that whatever happens in the session is audited and logged, and you can control who has access to be able to use Session Manager. And then Patch Manager. So I mentioned with RDS, we're going to manage the patches for you. When we're not managing it for you, we'll still try to help. And that's where Patch Manager comes in, is to help with those instances that you're managing yourself. But there are a lot of options, right? There are a lot of services that I do not have the time to get into right now. But organizations for managing multiple AWS accounts. Directory service is a big one when it comes to Microsoft workloads, because we can have a managed Active Directory. Instead of, you can run Active Directory in an EC2 instance, absolutely. But this allows you to have it as a managed service where, again, you don't have to worry about managing those domain controllers and all that. You just set up configure how you want the forest set up, and we'll manage the rest of it for you. And so, like I said, there's a lot of options depending on, certainly a lot of protection, guard duty, inspector, those type things, firewall, a lot of services. If you want to learn more, any of this, anything I'm talking about today, if you want to learn more, you can reach out to me, tstaab at amazon.com. If you are an active customer and you have an account manager, you can reach out to them. If you're a partner, you could reach out to your partner manager, or if you're working with a partner, obviously reach out to that partner. So what if I want to modernize SQL Server? I talked about this a little bit, right, with the schema conversion tool. Certainly could use that. We do have a newer feature that speaks directly to this, specifically for SQL Server. You may have heard about Babelfish. That is specifically, whereas the schema conversion tool I mentioned before is for a heterogeneous migration, but in general, you could go SQL Server to Postgres, SQL Server to MySQL. You could do Oracle to MySQL. There's a variety of things you could do. Babelfish is specifically SQL Server to Postgres. The idea being to minimize the heavy lifting on it, to make the whole process much easier. And in fact, so easy that you don't necessarily have to change anything on the application side. Even though it's now running in Postgres, by going through Babelfish, it understands some of the T-SQL language. It understands the driver, so your application can still think it's looking at SQL Server, even though it's technically looking at Postgres. So it's a great feature that was announced at reInvent, which is our big user conference every year. It was announced at reInvent in 2020. It was released publicly just before reInvent of 2021. And it's another example of the innovation I talked about before, listening to customers, and we continue to innovate. And there's more coming with Babelfish in the future. And like I said, that's specific to Postgres, but we really focus on this idea of purpose-built databases, rather than look to one database as sort of the solution to everything. We believe strongly that the best way to get that best-in-class performance and capabilities is to really break it down and say, okay, well, what are you trying to achieve here? because the goals of a relational database are very different from a key value database, which are very different from a document database, all down the line here. Each one has different goals, and the key for each one of these is to achieve those goals and maximize performance. So like Aurora, I've mentioned a couple of times, is a great example where we've taken MySQL and Postgres and cloud optimized them. And so that's in that relational database side of things, whereas DynamoDB is optimized specifically for key value. And that's basically it. I tried to make sure I didn't go too long, and I think I achieved that. Just looking at the time now, maybe went a little faster than I realized. But does anybody have any questions?
Lynn did that very well, Tom. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
So it seems like, so full disclosure, I work for Microsoft and I work with Azure Data Platform, and Tom works for AWS, and Prashant works for AIS. So we all deal with different cloud platforms. But Tom, it seems to me, especially when you're talking about regions and zones and availability, these are features that are kind of baked in. You have to have these to even be a competitive cloud vendor at all, right? I mean, you've got to make sure you've got uptime at the regional level. You've got to have uptime at the geographical level. You've got to have uptime at the data center level, much less the node itself. But they're all becoming sort of standard, I would say.
It is, yeah. It is getting there. I mean, honestly, it's one of those things that we take as a point of pride in that it is baked, like you said, baked in, right? For us, every time we design a data center, or sorry, every time we design a region, and every time we have designed every region going all the way back, they're always designed with this idea of multiple availability zones.
Right.
And so for us, one of the points of pride is seeing how others have adapted to that. Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, Azure, right? Azure is now doing this. But it's, they're going through I don't know, obviously, but what's probably a more expensive process and difficult process of having to retrofit it, because they recognize, okay, this is something where, AWS has the lead on this, but we can catch up, but we got to retrofit it into the regions. And as you're aware, it's challenging. Not every service on Azure supports it yet, for instance, because they weren't designed to support it. And that's why I always bring it up, because it's so important to us. And it's not important to everybody. And if you have a workload where that's not important, then yeah, you're not going to care about that piece. But for so many people, it is important. And that's why, everything we do starts from that point. Everything is designed to be multi-AZ. Every service that we create is designed to support that capability.
Yeah. Yeah. When I talk to customers, they're always interested in high availability of the node they're talking about that's hosting their data, and then high availability of the place where their server or their service is located. Yep. And high availability around the the geographical spot. I mean, we can go all into the nth degree on high availability. So yeah, it's for most customers, it's a big concern. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even get into the weeds with like storage, but just one example there, our block storage is Elastic Block Storage, EBS, is our block storage service, and I want to say a lot of people don't realize, but I know some people don't realize this. Anytime you say, okay, I want an EBS volume of whatever it is, doesn't matter the size, I need an EBS volume. Let's say it's 10 terabytes or something. You're not just getting a hard drive. You're getting two, because every EBS volume that we have is mirrored. All of them. That's the way EBS works from the ground up. every region, every EBS volume that we have is automatically mirrored. So it's an interesting conversation. Explain that to people, because people, if you're running something on-prem, right, one of the RAID styles, I can't think of the word right now, sorry, but one of them is to do RAID 10, where you're doing this, you're striping mirrored pairs, and it really throws people off. And I tell them, oh yeah, no problem, you can do that on EBS, just do RAID 0. Like, I'm not doing RAID 0, you're crazy. I'm like, yeah, RAID 0 is RAID 10. Right.
Right.
When you do RAID 0 on EBS, you're doing RAID 10.
Right. Just kind of gets people in, and they have to put another hat on, another way to think about things.
But yeah, it definitely throws people off when I mention that. But yeah, absolutely, that availability. I mean, that's what it's all about for me. Is moving to the cloud is all about availability. If I'm not concerned about availability, I can set up a server in my office here, right? But when it's in the cloud, now I expect it to be available.
Oh, hey, we got another question here. Also from Kernal. If you're using Azure PaaS services like managed instance, how can AWS be used for any disaster recovery in AWS? I'm kind of misreading the question. You might want to look at the chat to kind of clarify the question, or Kernal, come off mute if you want. But yeah, if you're using Azure PaaS services like managed instance, how can AWS use for disaster recovery? So
where your primary is Azure, and then DR for DR and AWS. You can absolutely do that. There are a variety of ways that you can do it. If it's a database thing, for instance, you could use DMS. It's hard to answer, in one, definitive thing. If you have more specific questions about that, absolutely shoot me an email. Like I say, I'll just put it in the chat here, but you can shoot me an email with more details if you want. And I can get a more specific answer. Some are more challenging than others, I'll be honest. For instance, sorry, Tim, I'm drawing a blank on the name. The managed SQL that's not a full instance, but it's just a
SQL Server managed instance.
Not the managed instance.
Yep. Azure Sql.
Yeah, is that what's called, Azure Sql? Yeah, where it's just basically just one database, right? So it's something like that. It's a little bit, it's different. We don't have an exact equivalent of that. We do have an equivalent. Like we have RDS, is what, like the what you mentioned, the managed instance essentially was launched as like that's the competitor to what we have for RDS.
Yeah.
The single database one's a little bit different and brings its own challenges. Well, I mean, let's be honest, it has its own challenges. Even using it, it's a little bit different than what you would be used to on-prem or with a managed instance. And likewise, doing the DR with it has its own challenges. Yes.
I have another question here. I'm sorry, I didn't know if you were wrapped up or not.
Sorry, no, I'm looking at the other question. So yes, in terms of, distance is the reason why asynchronous is recommended region to region. We do, so I didn't mention this earlier, but it is important to mention, even around the world, and absolutely, certainly between availability zones, the data, it's not like, okay, within one region, it's all on our backbone, but to get from Virginia to Ohio is going over the internet. No, it's still going on the AWS backbone. But it's the distance, right? To get from one availability zone to another. So if you think about the way we talk about it being the northern, there's a region in Northern Virginia, there's a region in Ohio, there's a region in Oregon, there's a region in California. Those are the 4 in the United States. So we never disclose. I don't even know where the actual data centers are. We don't disclose it for security reasons. But all of our data centers in the Northern Virginia region, they're going to be in that general area. They're not going to be in Florida, for instance, right? They're not going to be in Ohio. They're all going to be in the DC metro area, essentially. So having automatic failover from, say, and don't quote, I'm not saying this is where the data centers are. I'm just going to name cities, having lived in Virginia a long time. If you're trying to do, a synchronous, so not asynchronous, but you're trying to do synchronous commit between, say, Sterling and Reston, or, Herndon and Fairfax, or even Fairfax to Bethesda, right? They're all close enough that as long as we have a big enough pipe, the data can get there pretty fast. But when you try to go to Ohio, even at the speed of light, there's going to be an inherent latency to go that distance. And so and especially you start going, those are 2 of the closest ones, right? Between Virginia and Ohio, but especially you start going like Virginia to Tokyo, or to, Dublin, or something, it just, that distance, it just becomes unmanageable you end up causing more problems than you solve, because to maintain that, if for anyone not familiar with the way SQL Server works, to do a synchronous commit, right? First, it's going to write to the local log, then it's going to send that information. It's going to wait for confirmation from the secondary before it completes the local write and moves on. So you're really talking about going both directions. Like in the case of Virginia and Ohio, you're talking about going from Virginia to Ohio and back again. And that's why I just don't recommend it for synchronous workloads. Licensing, you had a question about license manager. I'll be honest, that's not my expertise, but yes, it does cover, your, like you said, the expiration dates, provisioning limits. I mean, that's the big part of it, is just to help customers manage those licenses as you get, again, like I said before about not everything mattering to everybody. If you have 1 instance of SQL Server, even if you have 10 instances of SQL Server, but you're doing what I mentioned before about the license included model, you don't need to worry about this at all, right? Because license included, technically you don't have to worry about the license at all. We have to worry about the license. But if you're running 500 SQL Server instances, and they're all BYOL, you want that tool to help you keep track of which licenses are used where. Like, you basically set up a pool. Okay, I've got licenses for whatever 100 cores of SQL Server, and then you keep track of, okay, this EC2 instance is using 8 of them. This instance is using 4. This one's using 12. Etc. I hope that helps.
Very good.
I want to see are there any other questions that we missed higher up? Can we get a recording? I think you answered that.
Chronal.
Yeah, Datadog. I saw there was a mention of further up about third party. Yeah, absolutely. We do a lot with Datadog. When I mentioned SolarWinds, I was thinking more specifically because, again, my personal experience a lot with SQL Sentry and Sentry One, and now that being part of that SolarWinds family. But of course, SQL Sentry is more SQL Server specific as well.
All right. Are there any other questions, guys? This has been a great way to start off 2022, Tom. Thank you very much. We got a little compliment there from Tunde. Awesome. Thanks, Tom.
All right. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Well, hey
I was
guys.
definitely a little nervous when you introduced me and said Bob Ward's coming next month, but we got a great speaker this month. I'm like, I don't know how you got to that conclusion from starting with Bob Ward to me being the great speaker. But
You're great. No, you're a very good speaker. No. Do not sell yourself. You're very good. You have a good conversational tone, but you're technical. It's good. It's good. It's good. No, it's just I was originally going to start the year out with the February meeting, but I was like, you know what, we just started in January, and then I reached out to you because I know we want to talk about multi-platform this year. There's no better way to start the kind of the multi-platform conversation with talking about something other than Azure, and then talk, focus on AWS this week. So thanks everybody for joining us, and thank you for spending some time with us this morning or this afternoon, Tom from sunny Florida.
Yeah, it is afternoon now. You're right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And,
Go
and thanks again for inviting me, Tim.
Hey, no problem. I'm going to stop the recording. And everybody, you'll see the recording posted up